I think as most of us saw, ransomware really dominated headlines for the last couple of years. And in large part, this was because we relied so heavily on different infrastructure, as well as kind of made this transition to working from home and banking from home and doing pretty much everything from home when COVID-19 hit. And we really saw this continue into 2021. So the Canadian Securities Establishment actually reported that global ransomware attacks grew by 151% in the first half of 2021 as compared to 2020. So ransomware is still very much a significant issue for anybody who is working basically anywhere and interacting with their mobile devices. And even though ransomware is still relatively new to mobile spaces, we've still seen an uptick in the levels of sophistication and the introduction of new malware families. So while ransomware is still pretty new to mobile spaces, we've really seen an uptick in the levels of sophistication as well as the introduction of new malware families. And here at Lookout, we've actually detected a rise in ransomware since 2020, a pretty significant rise at 225%. And this basically was detected as soon as COVID-19 hit and all of us kind of transitioned into our first lockdown and has continued into 2021. But like I said, until recently, mobile malware was pretty unsophisticated, and most of the time the attacker wouldn't be that successful. I mean, sometimes they would find success, but it mostly just relied on the initial shock value of a user seeing a ransomware note on their phones and not necessarily knowing how to proceed. And typically, if you turned off your phone, turned it back on again, everything would be fine. And the app wouldn't actually reinitiate the ransom note until you re-interacted with the application. And so this is pretty different from desktop ransomware that we've seen for years and years, because this older mobile ransomware didn't actually encrypt or lock down any of your device files or persist even past a reboot. They'd simply abuse some older features of previous Android operating system versions and persist this pop-up window on your device asking for a certain amount of money. But this really changed recently, and sophisticated mobile ransomware can now encrypt files on a device the same way that a PC ransomware does, just using a different method. And many attacks involve plastering your entire screen with a ransomware note that blocks you from doing anything else on your device, even persisting past a reboot. Attackers have typically abused a permission called System Alert Window in Android to create this overlay window that you just couldn't dismiss or circumvent. But then antivirus vendors started to detect and flag apps that could produce this behavior, and Google actually added protections against it in Android 10. So all of these ransomware developers that were relying on this particular feature needed to pivot if they wanted to execute more sophisticated and effective attacks. One malware family that has done this, for example, is Mallocker. And the developers here pivoted to make the attack far more sophisticated by manipulating notifications that you'd receive when getting a phone call. And these notifications then become the ransom note that's overlaid on your device and can't be closed. And the operating system actually prioritizes it because it sees it as being related to telephone calls. And the developers did this by overriding a callback method that's triggered when the user decides to move the current app into the background on their device. Now, by overriding this method, they're able to essentially cancel out the function of moving the malware to the background and maintain this persistent ransom note. And the ransomware also attempts to evade detection by masking its functionality. They actually encrypted all of the malicious code and hid it in a completely different folder within the Android application package. We've seen another malware family do this recently, and that malware family is called Lucy. And what the developers did here is they actually manipulated users into submitting payments for what's considered illegal activity. The malware's ransom note basically tells the victim they've been caught perusing illegal websites and that their personal data, as well as a photo snapped by the front-facing camera, has been submitted to the FBI, and they need to pay a $500 US fine, or else that fine will triple. So this method just uses a more sophisticated targeted attack toward users to try and convince them that they've done something wrong and be able to manipulate certain features of the device while not necessarily proving quite as sophisticated as Mallocker did. And then to compromise the device, they cleverly hid the ransomware in video streaming applications and then requested permissions to a service in Android called Streaming Video Optimization when the application's launched. If the user grants the permission, then the app actually gets access to all accessibility services used by the device, and this can give the application permission to perform touch gestures and grant itself additional permissions without any user interaction. So to conceal the server it's communicating with. Lucy also brings out all of the obfuscation that it possibly can. Two different methods in this case. First, it encrypts all of its domains, and then it also cycles through the encrypted domains using different API endpoints to randomly select the command and control server that it's going to communicate with. So this is pretty sophisticated for mobile ransomware. We haven't really seen cases like this in the past, and it seems like malware authors are really piggybacking off the success of desktop ransomware authors over the last couple of years. We've also seen some ransomware samples that implement so-called double extortion methods, where the malware encrypts your data, forces you to pay a ransom, then sends your data to the threat actor, him or herself, who extorts the victim for even more money unless they pay again. And this can prove particularly worrying for corporations whose employees have been compromised, since sensitive data may not be stored on an attacker's server. So this can prove particularly worrying for corporations, since many employees rely on their personal mobile devices to also store and interact with corporate infrastructure. And if any of this corporate data is stored on an attacker's server, this could be used for extortion at a larger scale against the corporation itself. So we've seen mobile ransomware grow pretty significantly over the last couple of years, and 2021 doesn't seem to be slowing this trend at all. So I think we can anticipate that going into 2022, we're going to see the development of even more sophisticated mobile ransomware families, as well as the continued distribution of these types of malware.